Welcome back to Inside the Story. Welcome back to our on-location videos. We have returned to the mountains of South Tyrol to tell you a story that isn't so much forgotten, but needs to be remembered. It's the story of the Habsburg fortifications here in South Tyrol, and also partly in the Karnik sector, which were built between the first half of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century. Forts built by the Imperial Royal Government of Vienna for defensive purposes. They were initially built against what had not yet become the Kingdom of Italy. We're talking about 1830 when the construction of the Fortezza fort began, much further on in the Sarco Valley. And it ends with the disarmament between 1908 and 1910 of those same forts. Now, you might ask yourselves, how is it possible that within just 80 years fortifications were built and then basically disarmed? Because the evolution of weaponry led to a complete revision of attitudes, tactics, strategies, and even defensive measures, starting with the forts. Behind me is the former Fort Landro. We are in the Landro Valley, very close to Cortina d'Ampezzo. This fort, and beyond that mountain, which is Monte Montespeci, its twin, Pratopiazza Fort, Plesvice, or the Ampezzo barrier, built at the end of the 19th century, when Austria-Hungary was already allied with Italy and the German Empire in the Triple Alliance for defensive purposes. This, too, will raise questions for you. Why would the Imperial Royal Government of Vienna have authorized the construction of additional defensive positions beyond those already existing, given an agreement like the Triple Alliance? Wasn't the Kingdom of Italy an ally of Vienna at the time? Certainly. The Imperial Royal Government didn't trust them. They didn't trust either the defensive strength of the Royal Army in the event of a future war, perhaps with France, nor did they trust the political stability, the political reliability of Italy. So they suspected the possibility that Italy might switch sides or surrender and allow hostile troops to pass through. For this reason, starting from 1880, the old fortifications were reviewed, updated, and new ones were built. For example, the fort at Alamiesta, Fort Landro, which over the years became a symbol far beyond its purely defensive role. The Landro fort remained in operation for about 30 years. By the end of 1888, it was already in operation, but it was disarmed before 1910. Why was it disarmed? Even though it was a massive, very large structure, it was essentially armored with large plates and early reinforced concrete, not enough to withstand modern artillery. As we already mentioned in another video on location, the one inside the Vittorio Veneto Battle Museum, the Great War was initially and essentially a war of technology. For the first time, technology had a very strong impact on the course of the war. The new weapons, the new cannons, the new explosives made everything much more difficult for the defenders. The new weapons, the new artillery, easily penetrate the old granite or early reinforced concrete armor. Not enough to guarantee protection. For this reason, forts like the one at Landro and others that we will see shortly are gradually abandoned, but not completely. The artillery is moved because these forts are not essentially just large barracks. They are barriers equipped with heavy weapons. However, the heavy weapons are moved, they are brought higher up to safer positions where they can fire at the enemy without any problems. The fort is used as a command center, as a supply depot, sometimes as a meeting point, or as a communication center. The fort also becomes a target, initially for the Italian artillery starting in 1915, but it is not a primary target, because the Italians themselves will gradually discover the truth. The fact that the Austrians, at least in the Landro and Ampezzo sector, have abandoned the forts. The Austrians themselves had already abandoned the town of Cortina d'Ampezzo, which at the time was under Austrian control, but was considered indefensible, a bowl-shaped valley exposed to an Italian advance. The Austrians prefer to retreat here in the Val di Landro, and especially behind me at Monte Montepiano, to put up a fierce resistance that will continue from the summer of 1915 until the autumn of 1915. In 1917, at the rout of Caporetto, when the front actually collapses, the Italians retreat and the situation is stabilized for about a year until the armistice of Villa Giusti in November 1918, which puts an end to the war. The Landro fort was abandoned starting in 1920. It was no longer needed. It had no function. The first railway in the Dolomites passes nearby. It is a railway built during wartime that was unified after the conflict ended. The branch built by the Austrians and the branch built by the Italians were connected. A railway that was initially only for military use and later also for commercial purposes, which would have its own life and reach its peak during the Cortina Winter Olympics in 1956. So we're talking about 70 years ago, a long time ago. But that's not all. The Landro fort has two more lives. The first one you can see high up behind me. Because, as we already told you in another on-location video last year, starting from the 1930s, the new Italian government, Mussolini's government, decided to build modern fortifications for a new defensive line. What would become known as the Alpine Wall of Vittorio, we've already talked about it. You can find the video on the channel. And the upper part. The upper part of Fort Landro was rebuilt as a modern bunker equipped with artillery and machine guns, as well as observation posts, as the new defensive line for the Landro sector, along with other fortifications we've already shown you in the video on the channel. So the fort had a new purpose, at least for a certain period, at least until the 1960s when the upper part of the fort was also abandoned. And little by little, the whole sector, starting from the late 1980s, was closed and no longer used. And we know the reason why. There is no longer the threat of the Warsaw Pact, but there is still a use. However, it's not exactly a military use. If you look at this wall, you'll notice the presence of a painted red cross. And you might say it's a hospital. Not exactly. At the end of the 1950s, a film was made here in the area, A Farewell to Arms, based on the great novel by Ernest Hemingway. It's a film with a star-studded cast. It's a blockbuster, as people would say many years later. And here at the old Landro fort, a field hospital is set up in the movie's fictional story. For this reason, the production asked the military property office for permission to use the fort and to paint a big white cross on it to simulate this field hospital. It's the fort's final chapter. A fort that today stands as a relic of the past, and it attracts many visitors. But be careful. I'm telling you, the fort is still a military structure. Even though there are openings and you've seen them, you can't go inside. Some people do it at their own risk. I don't recommend it. Also, because if you get hurt, the responsibility is yours. You can't hold anyone else accountable, but what matters is what remains. The memory of a past built by the Austrians and inherited by the Italians, a place that had several lives, including operational ones, fictional lives as well. And today it represents a legacy of what once was. The wartime past and how technological evolution quickly changed the perception of high mountain fortifications for both the military and civilians. Another fort, this is the Mitterberg fortification, Monte di Mezzo. We are above the village of Sesto in the Sesto Valley. We are still in South Tyrol. Another fortification built between 1884 and 1890. This one too was fortified with granite slabs, which at the time, we're talking about the late 1800s, were good protection for a fortification. This one too was built for anti-Italian purposes, the Sesto Valley. At the time, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But after 1866, with the cession of Veneto and Friuli to the Kingdom of Italy, clearly the enemy, Italy, was nearby. It was practically 8 kilometers away at the Monte Croce Comelico Pass. It was precisely from that pass that the worst news for Austria-Hungary could come, namely the Italian invasion. For this reason, the Armaments Inspectorate of the Imperial Royal Army decided to build the Sesto Barrier. The Mitterberg fort, which you can see here behind me, still exists today and has been recently renovated. And its twin, the Heidegg Fort, which stood on the other side of the valley and of which almost nothing remains today, just a few ruins that are almost unmistakable among the brush. These two forts were originally intended to block the passage of Italian troops, but the operational life of this fort lasted not even 2 years. In 1908, the order came to disarm it, because for the same reason as the Landro fort we saw earlier, artillery had made advances. Explosives are more powerful. High explosive shells can destroy and pierce granite slabs with ease. The fort is no longer safe. For this reason, the 3 120mm cannons, the 100mm mortars, and the machine guns are moved to other positions. Some of them on that mountain over there, Mount Castle di Dentro, the Energicell, where armored domes are being built to house the heavy artillery, all aimed toward the Monte Croce Comerico Pass. By May of 1915, Italy decides to enter the war alongside the Triple Entente, denouncing the Triple Alliance it had signed with Austria-Hungary and Germany. The town of Sesto is shaken. It is affected by the news. One of the villagers, a volunteer in the Schützen, writes in his diary, "If the Italians wanted to, they could simply stroll down from the pass to the railway, and we wouldn't be able to stop them until they reached Lienz." On the other hand, the Austrian defensive situation is, so to speak, terrible, not to say tragic. There is practically no one defending the Puster Valley, and in general the northern sector. Quite simply, for the past year, the entire population has been recruited into the army and sent to fight in Serbia or Galicia, very far away. In the village, only the territorial defense volunteers, the Schützen, are left, far too few. Not even 300 fighters against an Italian force estimated at about 3 brigades. As mentioned, the Italians, if they wanted to, could come down from the pass at the far end and overwhelm the defenses. And inexplicably, the Italians are not attacking. Why? Because they are misled by what today would be called intelligence, and at the time was simply the cunning of the villagers. What do? Waiting for reinforcements that will arrive in the form of the German Alpenkorps. Note, by the way, that in 1915, the Kingdom of Italy was not officially at war with the German Empire, so the Alpenkorps fights wearing Austrian uniforms, even though this is a violation of the rules of war. As we were saying, while waiting for the German reinforcements, the villagers continue to man the 2 forts, the Mitterberg and the Aid, which is its twin. They are no longer armed, they no longer have weapons inside, but during the day fires are lit inside the forts, using wet wood, which creates thick black smoke. And at night, the electric lights are turned on to make it seem like the garrisons are still in place and that the area is actually being guarded. For this reason, the Italians are fooled and do not attack. They prefer to use artillery. The artillery hits the 2 forts hard, especially the Aidek, which is bombarded between the end of July and the beginning of August, 1915, and is almost destroyed. The Mitterberg is spared. It only receives a few hits. Worse, much worse, happens to the village of Sesto below us, because the village is targeted by armor-piercing and especially incendiary shells, which devastate all the houses and even the parish church. The population is forced to evacuate. Homeland and war. Heimat, the homeland, in a visceral sense for the local population, and the war. All this, as mentioned, is reflected in the great bombing of Sesto in the summer of 1915. A bombing that displaces people, that causes a lot of damage in the city, but that leads to nothing. The Italians do not attack. They do not come down from the town. The Italians prefer to continue bombing and threatening the peaks of the so-called Sesto sundial. The feet of the Scalabroni, of Oliva, of Sala, of the great commanders of that period who launched the attack on the so-called Sentinel Pass, will go down in the legend of not only military exploits, but also mountaineering achievements. It is a more difficult, harsher war, fought among the rocks, fought at higher altitudes, fought with bullets, with rifles, with pistols, with hand grenades, but sometimes even simply with ice axes, with bayonets or with rocks. It is a harsh war. It is a war that ends, as in the other case, with the defeat at Caporetto. When the war ends for the village of Sesto, and it's the end of autumn 1917 with the retreat from Caporetto, the villagers return and find the village destroyed, burned, reduced to smoldering rubble. So what do they do then? To rebuild, they don't come here, to Mitterberg. They come to Mitterberg simply to sleep at night, because it's the only shelter still standing. Instead, they go to the other fort, to Adek, to recover everything useful for reconstruction. Everything is taken away. What remains of the fort is blown up with dynamite. And today, as we said, only a few poor ruins remain. As we mentioned, the people of the valley try to rebuild, but they have to wait for further developments. In 1919, the peace treaties, surprisingly, assigned Sesto to Italy. Why do I say surprisingly? Because the natural border, which is defined not only by the mountain ridges, behind me are the Dolomites, in front of me is the Carnic Ridge, so two completely different formations, is also defined by the flow of the rivers. The Sesto stream and the Bianco stream are tributaries of the Drava, and the Drava follows a different course compared to the Arienza, which then flows into the Isarco, into the Adige, and ends up in the Adriatic. The Drava flows toward the Danube, toward the Black Sea. It's the watershed. According to the watershed rule, the Sesto Valley and also the municipality of San Candido should remain in Austria. Instead, to the locals' surprise, they joined the Kingdom of Italy. Why? It's a strategic issue. It's a defensive issue. Italy asks for guarantees. According to some historians, this guarantee also involves food supplies sent by train to Austria to fight the famine. That's enough to make the Sesto Valley and its inhabitants join the Kingdom of Italy and close a chapter of our history.